Kia ora, good morning. Great to be here at Grace City this morning. It's good to be in church this morning. I kind of get the impression that churches all over New Zealand this morning, people will be singing at the top of their lungs. And it may not have to do with the songs that they're singing, but it may have to do with the result of a game last night in Dunedin, possibly. I don't know if that's the case or not. I got the privilege of heading over to Grace City East last night and hanging out with a bunch of people. We watched the game together. It was all the more exciting because at Grace City East, they have a leader there named Robin, who is from the UK. And it's always good when you get to defeat anybody from the UK at a sport that they invented. And so we're so grateful that the Kiwis beat the All Blacks beat the UK last night, or the English. Speaking of which, the Aussies, by the way, I'm from Australia, even though my accent is all mixed up. I'm a dual citizen with the United States and Australia. The Aussies won last night as well, which makes me believe that God is still in the business of doing miracles, which is amazing. They beat the Welsh last night convincingly. I won't tell you what the spread was because the All Blacks last night didn't have a very big spread in the game. And then last night as well, overnight, do we have any South Africans in the room? Some South Africans? You guys won as well. So the Southern Hemisphere is back in the rugby domination of the Northern Hemisphere. That's something to get excited about. Now, some of you are here this morning and you are brand new to the whole church thing. Like maybe you're watching online and I don't know how you stumbled across the link. Maybe you were looking for like Neighbours or Home and Away and you got some other guy with an Australian accent. But here's what's true. You come into a room like this on a Sunday morning and people, before it's even 9:30, like it's not even 9:30 yet, and people are singing at the top of their lungs. Some people are so excited about the songs, they've got their arms in the air and they've got their fists in the air. And you may be wondering, why in the world are people doing this on a Sunday morning? And it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. Like normally that takes people a couple of beers on a Saturday night at a rugby game before they start doing that kind of behavior. But here's what you need to know. Although last night in Dunedin, people were probably saying praise to the All Black bench, which has more caps than any other country in the world, by the way. Your bench could be like the A team for any team across the world. They were praising the team that came on in the second half, basically last night, that helped win the game. This morning, we sang praises to the one who has, and I love this line in the song that we sang. We sang these words, "To the Father are restored, to the Father are restored." And here's the reason why people get up so early on a Sunday morning, come into a place like this. They haven't even had a single beer yet, and they are singing at the top of their lungs because of that simple phrase, "To the Father are restored." You are in a room full of people, and if you're watching online with a group of people that know that phrase is true in their own life. Because of the person we sang about right after that, we sang this beautiful song, Jesus at the center of it all. Jesus is the whole reason we can sing "To the Father are restored." That's the whole reason why people get up on a Sunday morning and they sing at the top of their lungs. So please know, if you're brand new to the whole church thing, it's not a bunch of weirdos in this place, although we are kind of weird as well. But we're just as excited as people last night were down in Dunedin because the All Blacks' second team came on the field basically at the end of the game and won the game for them. That's why we get so excited, because we have been restored to the Father. That's what's so exciting on a Sunday morning. We're not just weirdos raising our hands, okay? We're excited about what God has done in our lives. So here's the deal. Last week, I started this little 2-week series called Soul Care, and we talked about this idea of slowing down. And I need to make an apology. At the end of last week, I didn't leave you with a ton of practical things to do this week in order to slow down. Okay, I gave you a couple of hints, a couple of ideas, but I didn't give you something super practical that you could go, oh, I can do that, and that will help me to slow down. Today, I want to solve that thing that I didn't do last week. So I want to give you something uber practical today. In fact, I'm going to invite you to take out your phones later on, and I'm going to get you to scan a QR code so you can actually take a tool with you that will help you to get really practical around this idea of slowing down. Before I get to that, though, I want to just share with you something that I don't share in too many places. I've shared it a few times before, but I don't share it a lot. In 2016, I was actually diagnosed with a disease, and it was one of those things that I had been struggling with. I'd seen some symptoms of it in my life, And then when I finally got the diagnosis, I actually looked back over my entire life and realized, oh, there were symptoms of this thing that had shown up all throughout my life. In fact, from my very earliest memories, I could see some of the symptoms popping up. And the first time, as I look back over my life, the first time I noticed it was actually on a Christmas morning when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I had been asking my parents for literally months. I'd been asking them for a skateboard. It was back in the probably in the 80s or early 90s, probably late 80s when skating had become really popular, and I so desperately wanted a Tony Hawk skateboard. Anybody remember that name, Tony Hawk, a famous skater? I desperately wanted a Tony Hawk skateboard. The only problem is all of the skateboards during the 80s, for some reason, they all had like skulls and crossbones on them on the bottom of the skateboard. And my parents were like uber conservative Christians. And they just thought, well, if my son ever skated on a skateboard with a skull and a crossbones on it, surely his life will just be a train wreck after that. And so they didn't want me to get that kind of a skateboard. But I was desperate. I was one of those kids who desperately wanted the skateboard. I remember on Christmas morning coming down, and there was under the tree something wrapped, and you know, skateboards, it's pretty obvious when you wrap them what they are. And so I was so stoked, I was so excited. And I remember opening the skateboard up and being so disappointed because it was actually a homemade skateboard. My parents had made a skateboard. You talk about disappointing. I never rode it, never showed it to a friend. I so desperately wanted more of a skateboard than the skateboard that I got. That was the first time that I noticed this issue popping up in my life. The next time that I noticed this symptom popping up in my life was when I was about 13, 14 years old. I had my own lawn mowing business, and so I had just started mowing lawns for a few friends around the community. And my dad used to put the lawnmower into the car and the whippersnipper into the car, and he would drop me off at people's homes, and I would mow lawns, and they were kind enough to, pay me a few dollars to mow their lawns. And before I would get paid, though, my dad would show up when I would call him from that person's phone, because this is before mobile phones and so on. And I would say, Dad, I'm ready to be picked up. He would come to the house. He would inspect the lawn before I could go and knock on the door and let the person know that I was done and receive my payment. Well, this symptom of this disease showed up again one time when I remember going to someone's door after my dad had inspected the lawn and knocking on the door, and they came out and they handed me a $20 note. Now, remember, this is in the 80s, folks. So like $20 was a big deal back then for like a 13, 14-year-old kid. And I remember as I was taking the $20 note, thinking to myself, I wish there was 2 of these. And then I remember this popping up again in my life. Later on, this symptom popped up again in my life when I was in my late teens, 19, almost 20 years old, and I got my first real job. And I remember getting my paycheck, and I remember seeing the numbers detracted from the paycheck because of this thing called taxes. Ever heard of this idea of taxes? And thinking to myself, man, if I didn't have to pay taxes, I would have more in my bank account. And I've noticed that this symptom has showed up over and over again. Finally, in 2016, I was diagnosed with this medical disease called, and we'll put it up on the screen here, moritis. Some of you are medical professionals, you know this disease. Some of you are laughing because you're thinking, no, you don't have moritis, Perko, you actually have moronitis, because you're a bit of a moron right now. But here's the medical definition, or at least Perko's medical definition of moritis. It's the insatiable desire for more. And here's the reality, and I don't mean, by the way, if you're suffering from an actual disease, like one you're struggling with medically right now, I don't mean to diminish any of that this morning. That's not my goal. But my goal was this. My goal is to help us all understand, whether you're a church person, not a church person, whether you believe the Bible, whether you believe Jesus or you don't believe in Jesus, makes no difference. There's a little bit of moritis in all of us. If we're being honest, there's a little bit of moritis in all of us. Now, I shared some examples of moritis in my life when it comes to like possessions or money or things that I would hold. But moritis actually shows up in all sorts of places. And some of you may be pushing back a little this morning. You might be thinking, you know what, Jason, actually, I don't struggle with moritis. I'm like really into like Scandinavian minimalism. And I like to shop at IKEA, and I don't need more things. In fact, our home has less. Well, here's the reality. You just like more of less. It's still moritis. It's still the same thing. So here's what I'd love for you to do. And this might be a bit of a stretch for some. I would love for you to just turn to your neighbor and just share with them one area of your life where you think maybe moritis sometimes pops itself up, or maybe it shows itself in your world. Maybe it's not possessions. Maybe you just like more time or more of something else. Turn to your neighbor, and I'm going to give you just a minute just to share with each other, where does moritis pop up in your life? And if you're watching online, we'd love it if you dive into the chat. You can just share with us in the chat where you see moritis popping up in your life from time to time. All right. Hopefully you had a chance to be honest with your neighbor. You may be thinking to yourself, not only are people singing at the top of their lungs and it's not even 9:30 in the morning, you may be thinking to yourself, we're already in group therapy. It's not even 10 a.m. yet, and I'm having to share some of these things with people next to me. The truth is this. Moritis is something that I think is inside of all of us. There's a little moritis in all of us. But here's the deal with moritis. Moritis is actually not all bad. Moritis is not all bad. I kind of painted the picture this morning as if moritis is kind of a bad thing. But the truth is, moritis is not all bad. In fact, one of the wisest men who ever lived, historically, historians would kind of think of this man as one of the wisest men that has ever lived. He was a king of the nation of Israel, one of the first kings. He was the third king of Israel, in fact. He said it this way. His name is Solomon. And I love what he said about moritis. Listen, look, let's put it up on the screen here. He says this: moritis is a sense of divine purpose in the human heart, a mysterious longing, this kind of insatiable desire for more, which nothing under the sun can satisfy except God. In fact, if you were to ask many people their story of coming to faith in God, their journey of actually becoming a follower of Jesus, or becoming somebody that believed in God, many times people will tell you a story of their insatiable desire to try and figure out, is there more to this life than what I'm experiencing? And on that quest to discover the answer to that question, is there more, they actually stumble into this idea or this reality that there is nothing in this world that can fully satisfy your soul except for God. John talked about the Alpha Course this morning and a big celebration this week that they had. And the Alpha Course is actually one of the safest places to explore that question. Is there more to this life? This insatiable desire for more that's inside of me, where does that come from? And is there an answer to that question? Is there more to this life? And many people actually discover a relationship with God because of that. So there is actually moritis in all of us, and it's not all bad. But here's what I've discovered. This has been my experience. If unchecked, moritis has the potential to destroy your soul. Moritis, if left unchecked, if not taken care of, if not medicated in some ways, or a solution for it come along, it actually has the potential to destroy your soul. And God knew this from the very beginning. God put this thing of moritis inside of all of us, hoping that we would go on a search and find out that there is nothing under the sun that can satisfy it except for God. But in the very beginning, God actually gave us an antidote for this issue of moritis that we all struggle with. And here's the good news. Even if you don't consider yourself a church person, even if you're not sure about the whole God thing, the Bible and Jesus and so on, the good news is this: the solution that God gave us in the very beginning, it's available for you as well. You don't even have to start believing the whole Bible to practice this solution, and it's available for you as well. And so I want to just go back in history, go back to the very beginning, and show you where God created this solution at the very start. In fact, I want to take you back to Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, where we kind of hear the historical documentation of how the earth began. And I want to share with you where this solution pops up in the very beginning. In Genesis chapter 1, we read that God created on day 1, he created light. On day 2, he created the sky. Day 3, land, sea, and plants. Day 4, sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, air and sea creatures. And then on day 6, he created land creatures, and he created you, and he created me, humanity. But then on day 7, a lot of people think that God didn't do anything, but he actually did create something. He created a solution for Moritis on day 7. In fact, let's read what it says on day 7 that he created. So on the 7th day, it says, he, God, rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Now, I'm not wearing them this morning. I'm wearing my favorite shoes, by the way, this morning. These are Allbirds, and they're made right here in New Zealand. I love Allbirds, most comfortable shoes. But I have a pair of shoes that I often wear when I'm teaching or when I'm speaking somewhere, and they are crisp white tennis shoes. And I oftentimes wear them, and the reason why I wear them is because they really kind of are a great example of what God did on this particular day. My tennis shoes that are crisp white, by the way, I'm a little neurotic. I keep them in a separate part of my closet away from all of the other tennis shoes, completely separate. And then when I travel with them, they have like their own place in my luggage that they go into so that nothing else can touch them. They're completely separate. And my white tennis shoes, in a sense, are really kind of holy shoes. Not because I wear them or because they're anything special, but because they're shoes that are set apart from all of the other shoes that I wear. God did the same thing on the 7th day. He created a day of the week that was set apart from all of the other days of the week. Every other day he was working, he was creating, but on this special day, the reason he called it holy is because holy literally means something that is set apart from everything else, and he created this special day of the week to help us with this issue of Moritis. Now, if you know the story of the nation of Israel at all, you'll know that a little later on, after God created the earth, the Israelites were actually taken into captivity by the Egyptians. And they were there for decades. In fact, generation after generation, they were there as slaves in Egypt. And because they were slaves, they were actually made to work 7 days a week. Many of them were put to work as kind of creators of bricks and so on. And so I can only imagine if you grew up in that era in Israel, you might have started creating a little bit of an identity around your work. Like you might have started saying to yourself, like, I'm 100 brick a day kind of guy. I can create like 100 bricks a day. And then somebody might compare themselves to you and be like, oh, well, my dad actually does 200 bricks a day. So he's a much better brick guy than your dad. But you started to develop a little bit of an identity around the work that you did because that's all you did as a slave. And so when God rescued the nation of Israel out of Egypt, God actually needed to reinstate this special day of the week into Jewish customs. So he created a law around it. And this law in the Jewish language, in the Jewish tradition, was referred to as Sabbath. You may have even heard of it. Even if you've never read the Bible before, you may have heard this idea that you've got to keep the Sabbath, this special day that Jewish people have been practicing for centuries. But then the Jews, over time, instead of worshiping the God of this practice, they began to actually worship the practice itself. Now, before we kind of point the finger at the Jews for stumbling into this worshiping the practice instead of the person, let me talk to just all the church people in the room for a moment. If you don't consider yourself a church person, you're not a Jesus follower yet, that's okay. We're thrilled that you're here. In fact, you're in one of the safest places to check out this thing called faith. But for all the people in the room that would call themselves church people and Christians, I'd love to just chat with you on kind of a real level, maybe even step on a little toes here this morning. Before we point our fingers at the Jews for beginning to worship the practice instead of the person, us Christians, us Jesus followers, us church people, we fall into this trap all the time. Like, for example, we start to feel guilty about not making it to church on a Sunday morning and maybe having to watch online because we've started to worship the practice of coming to church instead of the person that we came into this room to actually worship. Now, I am all about people coming to church. I think it's great. I'm all about people watching online. So if you're watching online this morning, we're thrilled that you're watching online. But don't confuse things. Don't confuse coming to church or watching online as some sort of special religious practice, because the whole point is to worship the person of Jesus, not to worship the practice of coming to church. And so before we point our fingers at the Jews, we have to be honest and say, you know what? We sometimes fall into the trap of doing that as well. Now, if you're not a church person and kind of tuned out for a minute, you can tune back in now. Family conversation is over, all right? But people began to worship the practice instead of the person. Until the first century, Jesus came along and he set the record straight once and for all. He and his followers actually were walking along together on a Sabbath day, and we have a record of some people challenging Jesus as to what his followers, his disciples, were doing on the Sabbath. See, they weren't supposed to be doing anything on the Sabbath. No paid or unpaid work. They were supposed to be doing nothing. And we pick up the story of Jesus and his followers, and this is where Jesus sets the record straight. In Mark chapter 2, we'll put it up on the screen, it says that one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. How dare they pick a head of grain? Now, anybody big fan of Nutri-Grain? Anybody eat Nutri-Grain as a cereal in the morning for breakfast? I imagine these followers of Jesus kind of walking along, picking up these light heads of grain, like little pieces of Nutri-Grain. They're doing this terrible thing on the Sabbath, this hard labor on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees, some of the religious leaders of the time, they questioned Jesus. They said this. It says, the Pharisees said to him, Jesus, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Now, Jesus is the most brilliant communicator. In fact, Jesus is a master of communication. And in his response to these people questioning things, Jesus gives a master class on how to communicate with people that have a different worldview than you. Don't miss what Jesus does here in his response. He says this. He answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? Now, remember the Pharisees, they loved King David. Jesus knew his audience. He was not unsure of who was challenging him and his disciples in this moment. Jesus knew his audience, and he leveraged who they worshiped, who they thought highly of, in order to give his response. Immediately, you can imagine the Pharisees, as soon as he says King David, they're like all ears, listening and leaning in. And then he says to them, in the days of Abiathar, another person they thought highly of, so now he's got all their attention. David, Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. So Jesus has set the stage to give a statement which is a game changer on this issue of Sabbath. He's now got them leaning in and wondering what he's going to say next. And then Jesus gives a statement which literally is a game changer. He says this, then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. In that very moment, in that one line, Jesus took the Sabbath. He took it from something no longer that you must do or you have to or you ought to. Jesus turned it into a get to. And I'm here to tell you that I grew up in kind of a church tradition. People might refer to it as kind of conservative evangelicalism. That I'm quite frankly a little ticked off that they kept the Sabbath from me for decades, thinking that it was some outdated Jewish thing that you have to do if you're Jewish, or you must do, or you ought to. I wish that somebody had shared with me this truth from Jesus long ago, that it's no longer a must do, it's not a have to, it's not an ought to, it's a get to. It's like every week God gives you an envelope with $1,000 in it. You don't have to open it. It's not a must do. It's not an ought to. But why wouldn't you open the envelope? It's a get to. Jesus, in this one moment, turned something that they thought they had to, ought to, must do, into a get to, and he invites us to do the same. When it comes to slowing down and practicing the presence of Jesus, I'm here to tell you, after decades of thinking it was some outdated Jewish law, it has become probably one of the most incredible, powerful practices in my life of practicing the presence of Jesus that I partake of every single week. And I want to share with you what that looks like on a practical level. So the question oftentimes that people ask me is, Perko, what do you actually do on Sabbath? What do you do on Sabbath? Do you just sit by a window and drink your cup of tea and hum Kumbaya all day? Is that kind of your Sabbath practice? I'm here to tell you, I'm an active guy. You can tell, I've been all over this stage this morning. I'm an active guy. I enjoy doing things. In fact, I watched a game last night with a group of people, and then I came back to where I was staying, and I watched another game after that because I like doing things. So what does it look like for someone that's active, or even somebody that just enjoys quiet, peaceful time on Sabbath? What does it look like to actually practice a Sabbath? Well, I want to share with you just 4 simple steps this morning to get really practical as we land the plane. And the first step is simply this: to stop any paid and unpaid work. And I practice this now for a full 24-hour period in the week. Now, when I first started practicing Sabbath years ago, a friend of mine invited me to consider the practice of Sabbath. And I looked at him and I said, have you seen my garage? Have you seen my backyard? A full 24 hours every week of no paid or unpaid work? Like, I got a lot of stuff to take care of. And so he challenged me just to take a 4-hour period every week where I stopped, I paused any paid or unpaid work. That's a great place to start. So that's step 1, no paid or unpaid work. We just stop all paid and unpaid work. Step number 2 is to rest. Most of us live at a pretty frenetic pace, and so because of that, we don't take the time to rest the way that our bodies really need us to. So when we Sabbath, we stop all of our paid and unpaid work, and we also rest. But then step number 3 is actually my favorite step on Sabbath. So we stop, we rest, but then we also delight in God's goodness to us. That's probably my favorite thing to do on Sabbath. And here's what I've discovered. What I find delightful, what I enjoy delighting in, what seems delighting to me, oftentimes looks different for other people. Like my wife, for instance, she delights in things that I don't take as much delight in. She delights in all of the indoor plants in our home. I don't delight in having to move them around or water them or carry them for her. But she delights in all of those things. I delight in going to live sporting events. I love it. It's delightful for me. She doesn't delight in that as much as I do. So I want to introduce you to a practical tool that my wife and I, in fact, our whole family has actually used, that has been incredibly helpful when it comes to this idea of Sabbath. And I'm going to bring it up on the screen. It's called a replenishment cycle. And it's a very simple tool. It's just something that you can fill in those 5 boxes with your most replenishing activities in your life. So you might put in there taking care of indoor plants, or you might put in there going for a walk. There's lots of different things that people put in there. And then I encourage people to actually put in the box not only the activity that they find replenishing, their top 5 most replenishing activities. I invite them to also put in the frequency and the duration of how often and how long they need to practice those activities. So a few of you have taken out your phones, you're taking pictures of it. We've got even one better. On the next slide is a QR code, so I want to invite you all to take out your phone, and that will actually give you a PDF of the replenishment cycle. And you can take it home. I think there was a little bit of struggle this morning. It was supposed to be editable where you could go in and actually edit it, but you can take it home now and you can print it off and you can fill it out by hand if you'd like to. But if we go to the next slide, we'll hold it. Sorry, a few people are still getting the scan. Let's go back to the QR code just for a moment so that everybody can capture that. But if we go to the next slide, once everybody's had a chance to do that, you'll notice on the next slide, there's 3 things in each box. It's the activity, the frequency, and the duration. Those are the 3 things I would encourage you to put in those boxes. Next slide actually is an example of my replenishment cycle. So it's a bit hard to read, but I'll just help you out there. One of the things I love doing is e-biking with my wife, Kristen. I find that incredibly replenishing. We turned in our young person's card a few months ago, and we are now officially old people on e-bikes in our neighborhood, and we love it. We love it. The next one I put there was time by the ocean. I love being able to just spend time by the ocean. Bottom right corner, I think I wrote down there, new dining experiences. My wife and I, we enjoy going to places that we've never been to before and trying food. We find that delighting. We find that replenishing. And then I put live sporting events. I mentioned that one before. And then I put hanging with my children. I have adult children now. And so anytime that I get to hang out with my adult children, in fact, tomorrow I'm going to be having brunch with my daughter, Olivia. She turns 21 tomorrow. I can't wait to hang out with her. That will be super replenishing. Now you have a replenishment cycle. I would encourage you to go home, spend some time thinking, God, what is it that you have uniquely wired me to find delightful, to find replenishing for my soul? And I would encourage you maybe as spouses to look at each other's replenishment cycle and think to yourselves, what are some of the areas that maybe overlap? And perhaps we could spend some time each week while we're practicing Sabbath just delighting in God's goodness to us through our replenishment cycle. And then the final step, I said there are 4 steps. Step 1, stop. Step 2, rest. Step 3 is to delight. And then step 4 is to contemplate, to simply contemplate God's goodness in your life. As you think of your replenishment cycle, make sure that you avoid things that are draining to you or distract you from God's goodness. As you're thinking about your replenishment cycle, make sure there are activities that actually cause you to rejoice in God's goodness, because this final step of Sabbath is to contemplate God's goodness in your life each week. It's a fantastic practice that will help you to slow down. A couple of words of warning, though, as we land the plane this morning. Here's what I want to warn you against. Make sure you choose practice over perfection. Don't contemplate at the end of your Sabbath, was that a good Sabbath? Did I do my Sabbath right? Remember, it's kind of like a gift every week. That $1,000 in the envelope, you don't sit there and contemplate, did I open the envelope correctly? Did I pull the money out of the envelope? The same as with Sabbath. We don't sit there practicing perfection. We just enjoy the practice. And then the second warning I would say to you is this: to worship the person, not the practice. Don't fall into the temptation of beginning to worship Sabbath. The whole point of a Sabbath rest each week is to simply refocus our attention back on the God of the universe that loves us, our Heavenly Father, and to worship Him and delight in His goodness to us. A friend of mine, his name is Kerry Newhoff. I love what he says when it comes to Sabbath. He says this: if you don't take a Sabbath, the Sabbath will take you. A word of warning to all of us. If you don't take a Sabbath, eventually, it may take time, it may take decades, but eventually the Sabbath will take you. Sabbath really, when it comes to our culture and our society today, Sabbath really is an act of resistance and surrender. Each week when I pause to Sabbath for a full 24-hour period, there is this pull towards getting something done during that time. There's a pull to being productive. Sabbath really is an act of resistance towards our culture that says you are what you do, you are what you have, you are what other people think of you. It's a resistance towards that pull, and it's an act of surrender to know that the God of the universe is going to take care of the world even when you are resting and delighting in Him. I love this quote from Wayne Muller about the Sabbath. I'm going to finish with this quote. When it comes to this idea of Sabbath being an act of resistance and surrender, he says this: Sabbath requires surrender. If we only stop when we are finished with all our work, we will never stop because our work is never completely done. If we refuse to rest until we are finished, we will never rest until we die. Some of us are actually going to take our to-do list into the coffin with us in the grave. Sabbath dissolves the artificial urgency of our days because it liberates us from the need to be finished. Here's the bottom line. Jesus, He transformed Sabbath from an have to or an ought to or a must do. He transformed it into a get to. And I'm begging you, I'm pleading with you, whether you've been following Jesus your whole life or you're not even sure about following Jesus yet, I'm begging you, I'm pleading with you to open up this incredible gift of Sabbath. It is life transforming. And experience what your Heavenly Father wants you to experience through this practice so that you can delight in Him. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for the gift of Sabbath. Thank you that it is not something that we have to do or we must do. God, thank you for this incredible line from Jesus that said, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Thank you that you turned it into a get to. And I pray, God, right now, that you would give each of us listening this morning the wisdom to understand what you're inviting us to do. And then would you give us the courage to do it, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.